I'd just like a little bit of a show of hands here to find out how many people here feel that they've gotten an adequate amount of sleep over the past month. Do I see any hands? A couple of hands. Well, like most Americans, the people here are simply not getting enough sleep. I'd like to ask one other question. How many people have never driven a car when you are drowsy? 2 people, okay. Yeah, well, that's reflective of all of our lives these days. The question that I'm going to pose is, why are we not sleeping as much? 10 times as many people today are sleeping less than 6 hours a night than, for example, when I was growing up. If we look at kids of all ages, 5-year-olds are getting 2 hours of sleep less a night than they did in earlier times. 10-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 20-year-olds, we're all sleeping a couple of hours less per night than we did in the past. So the question is, why are we sleeping less? And I think one of the key issues is actually the light to which we are exposed. And that may seem surprising, but electricity and the ability to turn it on whenever we wish, along with caffeine and other aspects of our technological lives, are actually reducing the amount of sleep that we have. And paradoxically, in order to understand this, we have to understand how sleep is organized within the usual day. And we have 2 major regulatory processes that affect how alert we are at any given moment. One of them is related to how many hours that we've slept and how long we've been awake. And the second is an internal clock in the brain that times sleep and times our tendency to feel alert and our tendency to feel sleepy. And paradoxically, that internal clock in the brain sends out a stronger and stronger drive for waking as the day wears on, and it opposes what would otherwise be an increasing drive for sleep the longer that we're awake. And this reaches a real apex near the end of our waking day, and we just have this internal clock sending out this strong signal to keep us awake, and that's when we get this second wind near the evening part of our day. What turns off this orchestrated increase in energy and alertness is the release of the sleep-promoting hormone melatonin. And that hormone is typically released an hour or 2 before we go to bed at night. But that release of the hormone can be suppressed by light, and it can also be shifted by light. So light exposure in the evening can not only suppress the release of that hormone today, but make it occur later on subsequent days. And I first learned what a profound effect this was having when we made the discovery a few years ago that some blind people who have no conscious light perception, that their internal circadian clock can be shifted by light that they can't see. And that's because just in the same way that the ear has 2 functions, one is for hearing and the other is for balance, also the eye has 2 functions. One is for seeing each other, and the other is for circadian photoreception, or resetting this internal clock. And so in this individual, even with his eyes covered, he has no ability to sense the light and also no response hormonally to his being exposed to light. But when his eyes are exposed, even though he is completely blind and unable to see the light, it immediately suppresses the release of this sleep-promoting hormone melatonin. But the amazing thing was when he lived with sighted people, we realized that the timing of this hormone was beginning to be released. The secretion of this hormone was being released at 11 or 12 o'clock at night. Whereas when he became an upperclassman at Boston College and got his own room, suddenly you notice that he was beginning to release this hormone in the afternoon, and it was actually reaching its peak at midnight. And it made me reflect on the fact that midnight is called midnight because it's actually the middle of the night if you were to look at the timing of the sun rising and setting. But of course, many people today are just beginning to check their email at midnight, start their homework, begin writing that novel, and taking on all sorts of other challenges and not even beginning to think about going to sleep. And so I actually went to an area where there is not electricity. It is about 5 hours outside of Curitiba, Brazil, where I managed to find a home where there were no electric lights. And I went to visit the parents of that family, and there were 7 children. One of the things I was curious about was how they managed when it got dark at 6 o'clock in the evening. The mother said, well, typically we go to bed. So I said, what do you do if a child wakes up? Because they're in this one room with a dirt floor, and all 9 of them are sleeping in this room. And I'm thinking, if we had to sleep with our kids and whatnot, chaos, pandemonium. And so I said, what do you do when it's dark and the kids wake up during the night? And the translator back and forth, Dr. Luzada, asking over and over again my question in different ways. And finally, the woman understood the question, and she said, we never wake up during the night. The children, we go to bed at dusk, and the children wake up at dawn. And I realized that the artificial light to which we're exposed is wreaking havoc on our ability to remain in sync with the 24-hour day. And I began to then look at the results of our laboratory experiments. We had studied hundreds of people in which we defined the daily rhythm of light sensitivity. And here you can see that light exposure in the evening hours resets our internal clock to a later hour, and light exposure in the morning is resetting your circadian system to an earlier hour. And that's how we keep in sync with the 24-hour day. As I mentioned, the second wind is lined up to occur late in the evening to allow us to stay awake for this marathon 16-hour wakefulness that we all experience each day. And then I was thinking about what must it have looked like 200 years ago, or what would it have looked like in this blind individual who was living in his own room and didn't have electric light. We would expect the daily rhythm of light sensitivity to take this shape. The melatonin would be released, as it was in his case, at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So the second wind would actually be taking place when we're all running to get a coffee break and so on. The artificial light to which we're ordinarily exposed has pushed the circadian system to a later hour and shifted us to the equivalent of Hawaiian time, shifted our brains westward, placed this second wind late in the evening, and squeezed the timing available for our biological night, because we're still getting up with the chickens. In fact, the biggest segment of the working population in terms of its temporal distribution is for jobs starting between 3:30 and 6:30 in the morning. So the jobs and the work are starting earlier. Our kids are going to school earlier. We're making the high school kids start at 7-something in the morning, even though 100 years ago they didn't start till 9. Kids back then didn't even use alarm clocks to get up for school. How many of you never used an alarm clock to get up when you were going to school, like 95% of the kids did at that time? So we've created this big squeeze. So we have this early wake time, the circadian surge in wake propensity, and it's an unintended consequence of artificial light. And then when we add in caffeine, many people don't realize that it has a half-life of 6 to 9 hours. So when we take it after dinner, it's going to interfere with the restorative value of sleep that we would otherwise get. The function of sleep is to repair and reorganize the brain. Sleep is critical for learning. In fact, we integrate the knowledge that we've learned today with our prior experiences, and we rehearse places we've been and routes that we've taken and so on during the night when we are asleep. It is also the time that we get insight. Now, if we don't get enough sleep, we're one of the few animals that deprives ourselves of sleep. And most other species, the only time that they're sleep deprived is when they're not getting enough to eat. And so the two systems are intertwined. We want to eat more if we're not sleeping enough. If we go on a diet and try to restrict our calories, but we're also restricting our sleep, then 75% of the weight that we lose is lean body mass rather than from fat, because of the changes in the hormonal environment that occur when we're not getting enough sleep. If you sleep for 4 or 5 hours a night, even for a week, men's testosterone levels drop to the same degree that they would having aged 10 years. So it has many different effects. It increases distractibility. Kids become hyperactive. Paradoxically, they don't become sleepy, but they have difficulty focusing attention. And we all become a little bit hypomanic. We don't quite become manic, but we get this feeling of euphoria. And that may be why sleep loss is associated with burnout, depression, and other adverse mental health consequences. And we're sleep depriving our kids. They're spending 8.5 hours a day on recreational media if they have a TV in their bedroom. And it turns out that they're spending more time doing that than sleeping. So it's no wonder that they're hyperactive. 1 out of 10 12-year-old boys is now diagnosed with ADHD. So what to do? To thrive, you have to decide if sleep is a priority, establish a regular bedtime, establish a regular wake time, find a cool, dark, quiet place to sleep, and make your bedroom a technology-free zone, because it's going to interfere with your ability to sleep. Get rid of the caffeine, get rid of the alarm clock, and find out how much sleep you really need, and then try to get that. And what could be the benefits? First of all, you're going to be able to concentrate so that you can perform better, you can be more accurate, you'll have greater insight, you'll have faster reflexes, reduced risk of injury, you optimize your metabolic fitness and your appetite, enhance your immunity, decrease your risk of infection, reduce your risk of diseases like diabetes and stroke and cancer and heart disease. Ben Franklin, famously, in the Poor Richard's Almanac, said there'll be sleeping enough in the grave. One thing I can tell you is that you'll get to that grave sooner if you don't sleep enough. If you want to thrive while alive, sleep. Thank you.